Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Dr. J. Simon Rofe from SOAS, the University of London, and together with my colleague Yann, we're going to host this afternoon's discussion. Thank you very much for joining us. I'll let Yann give a little bit of an introduction and you'll hear from me again in a moment or two. Yann.
Thank you, Simon. It's a real great honor to welcoming all of you. And for Mission 89, we want also to thank our co-organizer, which is SOAS, University of London. So thank you, Simon, for helping us to make this moment possible. Technically, I think everybody will follow the discussion. If you have any questions during the talks, please, you have a Q&A moderator. You can send your question to the Q&A moderator and we'll try to go through all your different questions. Video will be off for despite for the speaker, and we would like to be sure that everybody mute his mic when they are not talking. So me, I'm representing Mission 89 as a board member. We are a Swiss-based organizations and we are addressing youth trafficking, which is one of the key points of the discussion today. To go through youth trafficking, we have three key pillars. One is a awareness campaign and a workshop. We call it Not in Our Game. And this campaign can approach a vulnerable community to inform and assist youth in the issue of trafficking in sport. We also develop a membership campaign to try to gather different actors of the sector concerned about the issue. And we very think that collective thinking is key. And that's why, again, we are very, very excited about the talk today. And the last point is we do a kind of lobbying to promote the regulation environment, which we think is a key aspect to tackle trafficking. So today we are going to discuss how to improve outcomes for migrants, athletes, and trafficking victims, specifically with this COVID-19 situation, but beyond that. What we think at Mission 89 is when we look at those youth athletes which are hitting the road or facing problem of trafficking, we see a lot of talent, skills and motivations first. So we think that it's an amazing potential for development and social inclusion. So our DNA is to look at the situation with an empowerment vision. We think that all these skills can be used and activate for positive outcomes. So the first stage is definitely to recognize the skills and the potential of this youth athlete. And the second point is to transform those skills on positive opportunity for integrations to build a strong legacy for themselves, for their community, but also for society. So quickly, I want to welcome our panelists. It is great. Today we have panelists coming from very different environments, and I think by this diversity will help us a lot. And please, all the observer and follower of this discussion today, do not hesitate to send questions or to share your idea. We'll be very happy to include that to the discussions. So we are welcoming, and it's a great honor to welcome you, Baroness Lola Young. She's an incredible woman. She's a very committed person. She's, I have to say, an inspiration for Mission 89. And since she joined the House of Lords in 2004, where she activated the parliamentary group on ethics, sustainability in fashion sports, and modern slavery and human rights. Lola has been always very, very much committed in all modern form of slavery, and her commitment is really once again a strong inspiration for us. So welcome you, Lola, to be with us today. It's really fantastic. We also have Kirsty Burrows, and Kirsty, she's the founder and managing director of Sports Rights Solutions. She had a career as an elite sport physiotherapist, and through this journey, she decided to dedicate her time on human rights and ethical, which she do also as a consultant at the IOC and at the Council of Europe. So thank you, Kirsty, to be with us today. And we also have Raffaella Chiodo. She's an international policy and cooperation at UISP, which is an Italian sports organizations. And your organization, I think, have been working through refugee community during the pandemic. So also fantastic to have you with us, Raffaella. And so we have two more speakers with us. One is Nick Saul, and Nick is working for the UNHCR. He has a large role. He will explain more than I can, but I know he's very much involved in the sport. He covers all the sports sector, but he also works with the unit inside UNHCR working on trafficking. And I had the pleasure to meet him previously on the fantastic work that UNHCR is doing with refugees, specifically empowerment through sport with the Refugee Olympic team. And congratulations for all of that. So your experience is going to be very important. And our last speaker is Laurent de Boeck, which is a great leader. He's doing an amazing job with his team based in Egypt for the International Organization of Migration, IOM. We had the chance to deliver a workshop, not in our game, with his team, and I can tell you that they all mobilization so much, they mobilize so much energy to assist the migrants which arrive in Cairo, but in Egypt. So Laurent de Boeck is an expert in migrations, governance, and policy development. He has a very large background, degrees in public and international affairs, diplomacy, international economy, social and economic science from the University of Leuven. And once again, he's a great manager with a fantastic team working toward migrants every single day. So thank you, Laurent, for being with us. So I pass the floor to Simon to start the discussions. Again, thank you to SOAS, University of London. Simon, you have a strong background in sports diplomacy. You've been working in a fantastic experience, which was a LOCOC for London 2012. And you are very much committed with the Center of International Study and Diplomacy at SOAS. So I pass the floor to you. And once again, thank you for all of you to join us today. And we wish you a great talk today.
Thank you so much, Yann. Just to reiterate, it's a great pleasure to be here. I don't want to take up too much more of this valuable discussion time. I'm looking forward to hearing what others have got to say. But just one thing to say around the role I have here at SOAS as head of the Sport Diplomacy and Governance Hub, recognising that the confluence of the worlds of sport and diplomacy and the governance and ethics and values that underpin all of those wonderful things we see in the world is really what I'm most interested in, both as a scholar, but frankly, amongst this audience, at least as much as a practitioner, being able to bring together networks of networks, understanding how different people in different realms work together on issues that often overlap. That doesn't mean we always have the same interests all of the time, but the opportunities when those interests do overlap to work together, and particularly to learn from each other, reflect on good practice, and bring benefit to broader society, is really what I'm most interested in, indeed passionate about in this space. So without any further ado on my behalf, it's with great pleasure that I turn over to Baroness Young, who will introduce herself and provide a few words about the issue on her behalf. Thank you so much, Lola.
Thank you very much, Simon, and thanks to Lorena and colleagues at Mission 89 and everybody at SOAS for making this happen. I guess one of the few advantages to come out of this crisis has been the ability to speak with colleagues from all over the world at not at the cost of the environment in such an explicit way, and certainly a little bit cheaper. So it's really good to have an international audience and colleagues here today. Thank you very much for inviting me to say a few words. As has already been mentioned, I'm a member of the UK Parliament's House of Lords, and I sit on what we call the crossbenches, which means I'm politically independent, not aligned to a political party, which allows me a little bit of freedom in how I go about doing things. And I set up 2 all-party parliamentary groups, which are cross-party groups within the House of Lords and the House of Commons, One has already been mentioned, the ethics and sustainability in fashion, and the other one is sport, modern slavery and human rights. And both Simon and Lorena have participated and contributed to sessions for that latter group. And that's important because we are able then to feed things through to government, to try and influence policy making and fellow parliamentarians, and also to back and support some of these really, really important campaigns. When I first started out looking at modern slavery, in fact, I was much more concerned with supply chains in sport, particularly in football, and had no idea, to be frank, about trafficking and modern forms of slavery within the sporting bodies, within the sporting groups. So that was a bit of a shocker, and thanks to Lorena for bringing all of that to my attention. I think at the moment, actually, I've just been appointed to a House of Lords select committee on COVID-19, where we're looking at the economic, social, cultural impact on the UK. And I think this is such an important area not to be forgotten. Because I think what's happened with COVID-19, it's clear to me, is that it's both exposed and exacerbated existing inequalities and made those who were formerly vulnerable even more so. And whether you think about it within the UK, where I'm based, or whether you think about it on the continent of Africa or Latin America or in the Caribbean, wherever you look, the key thing that I take away is the vulnerability of lots and lots of Black people and brown people, particularly when it comes to sport. So I think what COVID-19 has done is to launch to these areas. And when we think about the fact that we're still in the middle of it, if you think about it globally rather than just from the point of view of this little island, we are, or even from the point of view of being here in the UK, we're not through it yet, and we still have yet to get to grips with what all of these implications are for the future, how we can change the way in which we go about things. I would also want to link this subject that we're talking about to the struggle against racism and Black Lives Matter, because as I've said, many of the people, indeed I would venture to suggest that most of the people that are become most vulnerable to exploitation and to trafficking and to forced labor and to modern forms of slavery come from sub-Saharan Africa and again across Southern America. So I think we very much need to address these disproportionately negative impacts that there are on migrants, on people who have been caught up in these or lured into these really difficult and awful situations that happens in ordinary times. I mean, that is ordinary, sadly to say. Now we're in these extraordinary times, it's even worse. So as far as I'm concerned, you know, I'll do what I can to support Mission 89 in its quest to raise awareness and draw attention to what's going on, because it has to be said, I don't think most people understand that this goes on within the sporting world. And to say that I'm pleased that at last, through Mission 89, they've managed to get Trafficking in Persons report to, for the first time, explicitly address this issue of trafficking of people in and through sport. That's it from me.
Thank you, Lola. Really important place to start. Thank you. Appreciate that. Just to reiterate, we do have the chat facility. So as you know, people are speaking, please do feel free to use that. I'm now going to turn over to Kirsty.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Simon, and thank you to Mission 89 for organising this roundtable. So my name is Kirsty Burrows. As mentioned, I'm the Managing Director of Sports Rights Solutions. My background, as mentioned at the beginning, I actually used to be an elite sport physiotherapist working in Southeast Asia, in the Middle East. I also worked in Central Europe for a while. And then I went on to do a master's in the management law and humanities within the sporting context, later specialising in sort of ethics and integrity issues within sport, with a special focus. Actually, my focus is the prevention of harassment and abuse in sport. So specifically looking at things like the prevention of sexual harassment, sexual abuse, psychological abuse, neglect and physical abuse within the sporting context, but also with an interest in other areas such as access and opportunity for women and girls, and developing psychologically safe environments for athletes to train and compete. So they're sort of the areas within which I work, which obviously we have many ties there into trafficking, and although that's not specifically where I've been working before, as we can see from the sports organisation perspective, it's there are many links, and especially now that we're looking also at the current COVID situation, exploring really the role of sports organisations here, in two ways really. In one way, how can sports organisations prevent harassment, abuse, exploitation, trafficking in sport? Obviously, all of these things being the antithesis of the values of sport. So how to prevent abuse and exploitation happening through sports, and the other side of it being the role that sports can play in actually the protection and promotion of health and well-being and fundamental rights. So that's sort of my very specific area of interest, and specifically now we're looking at COVID. I mean, we know that before the crisis, as many as 66 million children were already living in precarious socioeconomic situations, and this is only going to increase. So in terms of, you know, the risks then and of human rights abuses, including through sport, and also the role sports can play in actually providing support mechanisms. I recently had the great honor of co-authoring a paper, and I see that two of my co-authors, including Dorothy Rosger, who led actually the call for this paper to be developed, are on the call. So hello, and it's fantastic to see you here, and Olawale as well. And this paper is on the sport-related outcomes of COVID and the sport-related impacts of COVID on children. It's available on the Centre for Sport and Human Rights website, if you'd like to have a look at that. So that is sort of my area and what I'll be talking about today, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from my fellow speakers and seeing how we can work together to make sure that sport promotes and protects human rights.
Thank you so much, Kirsty. Really appreciate your perspective, and please do take a look at that report. It's you know, a very interesting read. I would thoroughly recommend it. Now, if I may turn to Nick Saw from UNHCR.
Thank you, Simon. As Yann said, my name is Nick Saw. I'm the Senior Refugee Sports Coordinator at UNHCR. It's a bit of a strange title, considering I'm the only sports focal point in UNHCR at the headquarters level, but you know, I like to give these titles out. My focus within the organisation is really trying to see how we can work with sports organisations and entities using sport as a tool to improve the protection space and protection outcomes for displaced and stateless young people. And I think that with the new Global Compact on Refugees framework and the idea that the refugee response is now a whole of society approach and not just the purview per se of humanitarian organisations and states, sports and sports entities become even more important. And I think that UNHCR has long-term partnerships with the International Olympic Committee and a number of other sports agencies that work with us to try to achieve this. From UNHCR's perspective, you know, the COVID situation, I think as Baroness Yann alluded to earlier, has really exacerbated existing protection challenges, and you know, for the people that we work with, I mean, these protection challenges start off with the health challenges, but then there are the broader protection challenges that we see in terms of young people engaging in risky work and child marriage, increase in child marriage, but also the socioeconomic challenges. I mean, the COVID-19 situation has increased the socioeconomic challenges globally, but for these already very, very vulnerable populations, what it means is that communities can no longer afford to rent properties. They can't afford food. Education has gone out the window. The increase in vulnerabilities means an increase in opportunities for people who engage in trafficking and other nefarious acts. But it also means that where there are existing trafficking victims of trafficking or trafficking cases that are underway, that states in some circumstances have been unable to follow up on these situations, that people who have been arrested on suspicion of trafficking have been released on bail because it's impossible to try them. And it means also that in some situations, people who are availing of specific accommodation or protection mechanisms are no longer able to stay in those mechanisms because the guidance around the amount of time that they can stay in those situations has expired. So, for example, if it's 30 days in a safe house or 60 days in a safe house, and that period expires because of COVID, then we find ourselves with a whole new set of protection challenges. So I'll stop there for now, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. And again, thank you to Lorena, Simon, and Co for the invitation to participate.
Thank you so much, Nick. I really appreciate those thoughts too, and certainly the idea of protection and what protection looks like in our COVID world is something that we need to think about. Okay, last but by no means least, I'd like to turn to Laurent to speak first.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Lorena, to associate me with this very, I believe, important discussion in the context of way forward to what we call a new normal, which to me is by far normal. So I'm Laurent de Boeck. I work for the International Organization for Migration. Trafficking and smuggling are both important portfolio of our work. We are an intergovernmental organization, recently member of the United Nations. So we work with our member states to develop frameworks to prevent or to increase law enforcement and to support victims of trafficking worldwide. I've been myself deployed to a series of countries of various types, generally in what we call crisis countries, human-made or natural induced crisis, where we could see a situation of abuse and exploitation by gangs taking advantage of the collapse of states. But it has always been also be the case with countries more in what we call developing world, where we have worked with countries and regions in a national or international setup for increasing the fight against trafficking and smuggling. I'm particularly interested in trafficking in sport because I believe that although it's recognized, sport is recognized in the agenda for sustainable development, and particularly Article 37, referring to sport as a conducive element for development. I'm not sure that it has received enough attention for the role sport can play in development and peace, but in particular the situation of sport as being abused for exploiting the youth. So we have worked as an organization globally when I was in charge of labor mobility for the world in our headquarters, in developing a better understanding of the situation of exploitation in sport, but I realized that there is not enough recognition, not enough statistics and data collected on this situation. Now I'm working in Egypt as representative of the organization. Egypt is quite important in terms of number of migrants living in the country. We have counted 6.3 million migrants currently in Egypt, but also because Egypt, as part of the entire continent as well, is counting a very important number of youth. So youth Egyptians are also looking at opportunities and contemplate migration as a possible alternative to their integration into the local market. By looking at this, at migration, they do not necessarily receive the appropriate capacity or have the appropriate capacity, which are not necessarily recognized for migrating regularly or legally. So the multitude of proposals of people also luring them in proposing beautiful dreams of joining a football team outside is increasing, and they do not understand that they are or they will become subject of exploitation, and this remains quite important to look at as one form of trafficking. But as I said, I think this event is one of those we should multiply to actually give a better focus on our sport. We should be a vector for peace and development, can be actually used for abusing people. In the context of COVID, in particular, it has been mentioned by my predecessors, we really have to be attentive on situation, because the socioeconomic impact of the COVID is quite important, and we see it already as increased vulnerabilities of migrants, increased vulnerability or potential attractiveness of the youth of Egypt to irregular migration, and then potentially exploitation. So we need to be very attentive in identifying solutions for ensuring that the people are well informed about the situation, but also do report of any abuse in their when approached by traffickers or smugglers. But I will certainly discuss this further when I have the floor. So I'm just to summarize, then very happy to be with you and give very high importance to this subject, which I believe is not touched upon enough. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laurent. I was premature. Laurent was playing penultimate speaker. I now have the pleasure of turning over to Raffaella from a very hot Rome.
Let me start from saying that I am not speaking on behalf of the, let's say, elite sport, but I am representing an association that is working in grassroots sport. So we have a specific perspective, of course, of from our background and also our, let's say, our landscape where we work. So what we use is to it is needed that I just give some very short information concerning our association, just to understand what kind of picture we have and where we are working and acting, including, of course, refugees specific work. Our association is a Sport for All association, and it has 1,300,000 members in all the country. And we have about 121 committees, local committees based on all over the country, and 14,000 clubs, sporting clubs. So it gives a picture of quite a large association that is based in the different areas of the country. So we face the different kind of problems we have in the country as such, and obviously concerning refugees with a specific focus in some areas of the country, but very different areas. It can be the north, Turin, or it can be Sicily or Calabria, where usually refugees arise by boat, as you know, crossing the Mediterranean Sea. So what we have from our perspective is a picture, if we look to the COVID specific time, which we used to say during the COVID, like it is something already in the past, but unfortunately it isn't in the past. We are in the middle, and we just can hope that the perspective will be looking to the end as soon as possible. But I just participated in the morning in a meeting of our association that was really, really hard, because we had to take decisions on how to continue our work. And this is a really, really, really difficult situation. And obviously this is affecting also all our work on trying to use, as we used to do, sport for inclusion and specifically for refugees inclusions. What we do is obviously working in trying to combine the fight against racism, that is a permanent work we are developing. It is part of our core mission of the association, fighting social exclusion and obviously racism and other kind of discriminations in the society. And in this period, we try to face the situation, the lockdown, of course, and all the consequences, trying to provide, not only trying, but doing, developing a campaign that was called Our Home is Our Gym. And obviously with home, we mean everything, also the welcome centers where some of the refugees live, and even other kind of conditions which are really not comfortable. But so when we try to work on this, trying to maintain the relationship with our members, and not only the members, but people who used to participate in our activities, and obviously also including the refugees, it has been a very, very hard time during the lockdown, and now is somehow just coming out from this critical situation, but continue to be a critical situation, and who knows when it will be, become a new normal, because we have many new normal times. We believe we are in the middle. So what we have been doing was to providing via internet and social media, Facebook groups, WhatsApp groups, and any other digital way of communication. We establish relationships with our participants to the activities, and including the refugees. Just to give you an example, we have a football team that is called Liberinantes. It's only composed by refugees and asylum seekers in Rome. And this team, as you can imagine, would not be able to practice anymore in the playground we used to do our activities. And obviously it was very, very hard to try to contact them, also because the places where they are based are not providing any Wi-Fi, any internet connection. So it was quite hard to try to find a solution for establishing and maintaining a relationship that cannot be just by a phone, the normal mobile call. So we for example, advocate and try to claim and ask and develop an appeal to where the national phone companies, in order to try to find a solution. And we found one of the companies that gives us the chance to offer to these places where refugees are based to have an internet connection. And this permit us to develop the training courses and the physical activities we develop through the obviously the video communication with them. So it wasn't just, you know, a physical activity that many of us practice via an app taken by via internet, but it was a real interaction with the operators and trainers. And obviously, let's say, considering the space they had for them to act, because they were quite closed in one room for 10 people, for example, which was a quite not safe situation in considering the COVID. And in general, but we found a solution in order to maintain this relationship. And of course, it wasn't just a question of maintaining a relationship for maintaining the physical, let's say, tonification or activity, but it was especially a human relationship that was crucial for them, and to be able to know that we didn't forget about them as close in some places like we were closing our houses, of course. So it was very important, this relationship. It wasn't just important for the refugees, it was important for all the members we maintain and develop with relationships. But just to give you, I know I don't have so much time, so I would like to give you a lot of information. So probably it would be nice if I share with you some papers after the meeting and establishing a relationship. But just to give you an example of how we are facing in the last years, I don't know, a kind of contradiction. I'm talking about the fact that we were acting a lot concerning, especially football, against the trafficking, especially of the very, very young people, very young boys and girls in trafficking in sport. And we were campaigning at the European level and national level in order to try to convince all the different football institutions to take in consideration this problem and try to establish regulations that try to avoid this kind of situation of trafficking. So now we were facing in the last year, and especially 1 year ago, we developed a campaign together with the UNHCR, Italian section, and Liberinantes, the team I told you just a few minutes ago, the team composed by refugees, and we, as UISP and ASGI, it is an association of for juridical rights for migrants. We established a campaign in order to ask for the change of the different rules, at least at amateur level, for football. National league, for amateur football national league, in order to cancel those points that were think for fighting against trafficking, but today they became like a norm in order to block and make impossible the full right to access to sport championship for refugees and asylum seekers. We were successful. We are very happy for this. We get this, and just this year, the team started to participate with full right to be considered in the championship, because we were already allowed to participate in the championship, but without points. We were like ghosts. So for 10 years, refugee team was playing, even at the first position, but without any point. Now we were starting the first championship together and with the full access and the full recognition. And unfortunately, COVID arrived. So we have everything against, even the COVID arrives to block participation of refugees. But this is just a small information. I hope I didn't took too much time.
Thank you very much. I think it's worthwhile thinking about some of these examples and some of the different connections that we see in this space. You know, the regulation and the governance of these issues. So thank you all very, very much. I'm looking forward to hearing what our audience has to say and questions that might come to the fore. I think I might take the liberty, if I may, pointing to some of the issues that have come up here around communication, and particularly about different forms of communication amongst migrant and trafficked communities and amongst those seeking to address it, and indeed those who are seeking to profit from it. It seems that one of the issues here is around how we communicate with each other. How there's information shared? How is information not shared? You know, where are the silos that prevent immigration services talking to healthcare, talking to the football world in many cases, but other sports too. Wonder if any of the panel could speak to some of those points around the opportunities that we have here, maybe through engaging with the likes of communications companies, the mobile phones that sit on our desks and what have you. But those things aren't necessarily available. Lots of the communication amongst trafficked communities seems to me amongst those who are word of mouth and notes and other networks that don't rely on bits of technology and masts on top of buildings. I'll leave that there and wonder what do the panel think of that? Who'd like to come in?
Can I say something on communication?
Please do.
Yeah. No, thank you very much. I think it's key. It's indeed, if we can prevent the situation, we wouldn't have to put all these mechanisms in place for protecting the people. But while we certainly need to communicate more on the situation, I think the decision to migrate remains individual. But as an individual, and particularly the youth, they may not have or we tend to believe that they take the decision alone, but they may not have that liberty. I think in the communication, we need certainly to target the youth, but their parents, who are playing an important role, even at the community level, or community leaders, to ensure that they do not pressurize or took the decision to actually send their son. This being said, I've been working in Yemen, for example, where we had more than 100,000 migrants from Ethiopia coming every year, despite there was a war, very heavy war still ongoing, unfortunately. Among those, 35% were coming back, meaning we were returning them after they even sometimes lost a arm, a leg. They were going back home, but their parents were telling them, you have to do it again, because we have no other choice. And so they were coming back knowing very well in what situation they would go. And by discussing with some people, they will take the risk of being exploited, being almost killed, because it's a survival situation. So communication is not enough. They may know and may be fully aware of where they are going, part of them at least. I think we need to work on alternatives to those options. It's not, we need to communicate, we need to increase communication, but saying to people, it's dangerous, don't do it, is never enough. We will need to say, don't do it, it's dangerous, it's exploitative, here is an alternative. And that means having institutions working together in developing the right pathways for offering to the youth a choice, and a choice which is guaranteeing a certain level of protection and rights. And that is why we do not only communicate and do campaigns, but we need to also increase skills, having the recognition of those skills, not only that we can develop vocational training centers, institutes for those people accessing those skills, but to have the private sector and any federation or institution being linked to those institutions which are guaranteeing an increase of skills for from the skills improvement and capacity building improvement, getting an entry into the labor market, being in the national level or internationally. So labor mobility between countries involving like developing specific frameworks based on skills recognition is essential. If we don't do that, just mentioning that it's dangerous, that you may face exploitation, will not be enough. It will never be enough. I think we need to concurrently work on additional prevention tools and only communication. But I don't want to diminish communication. I want to increase it, but to couple it with additional measures.
If I could add on that,
Kirsty.
thank you, Simon. So another couple of things to consider in fantastic points is, you know, we're seeing a lot of challenges, for example, when we think of displaced persons or irregular migrants, for example, things to consider such as linguistic challenges or cultural linguistic challenges, ensuring that the spread of information that we ensure accurate information. So when we're looking at communication, is there an availability of accurate communication that is accessible, that can be understood? How do we stop misinformation? In terms of, you know, as I said, I work specifically on the prevention of abuse in sport, and indeed in the same, both of these areas they're areas which can just get pushed further and further underground. It's very difficult for people to seek help and assistance. Even more so now when the systems are under pressure, and you may be in a very new environment where you're not able to communicate, where you don't have access to healthcare, you don't have access to the local services and knowing where to go to. So I think ensuring that the communication, that we look at those cultural linguistic challenges, that we look at accessibility of communication is hugely important. And the other point is two-way communication. I think a lot of the time what we're trying to do is trying to communicate, but not getting the information back from those affected, from children, from marginalized persons, from vulnerable groups, to really see, to really get their perspective and ensure that we embed that into the initiatives that are being developed to try and address and to try and assist vulnerable people.
Thank you. Nick, did you want to comment?
Yeah, I was actually gonna jump in after Laurent, because I mean, I think obviously it's for those who don't know, UNHCR and IOM work very, very closely together on trafficking issues, and we have been working for quite a while on a global SOP, standard operating procedure, that you know, is looking at the situation perhaps more holistically than we have done in the past, and so this is a type of communication and cooperation between agencies working on this specific issue, that is essential to ensure that we're all working in the same direction to achieve the best outcomes, but at an individual and a systemic level. Then I think on the communicating with affected, you know, or potential young people who have the potential to be trafficked, you know, it's become clear that organizations such as UNHCR sometimes have less credibility in storytelling to young people who you know, might be at risk of trafficking than a fake agent or a trafficker, someone who's promising the streets paved with gold, and you know, this kind of top-down storytelling in terms of you know, you must not travel, you know, you shouldn't do this, it's bad for you, you know, is not working, and is not what's needed. And I think we're trying to look at it from different perspectives. So the colleagues in West Africa have developed a platform telling the real story. So if you go, you can have a look at it on tellingtherealstory.org. And it's the idea is that it's you know, people with lived experience of trafficking tell their stories, and so rather than UNHCR or IOM or states telling people they shouldn't move, this is, you know, these are people's actual experiences. It is a web-based platform, but it's available on a mobile phone as well, and it's you know, a different approach to storytelling around this. And I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you, Nick. Lola.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree with what's been said. Communication is incredibly important. Of course it is, and the kind of developments which Nick has just foregrounded is the kind of area in which I think Mission 89 is looking. But I mean, it has to be said that, you know, desperation is the driver. And if we look at the economic impact of COVID-19, as I said earlier, I sort of work quite a lot with the garment industry, and the loss of jobs in the garment industry, particularly in the Indian subcontinent, but also elsewhere, is enormous. I've also read or heard that Africa, the continent, has lost something like 20 million jobs at the beginning of what was the beginning for us here in the West of the advent of COVID-19. And if you think that hasn't really even finished at all, so with that loss of employment, with the loss of those possibilities in a legitimate job, no matter how sort of poorly paid, comes the desperation that people really feel that they don't have a choice but to take up some of these spurious offers of work or employment or participation in sport on the promise of lucrative contracts eventually. So there has to be a place for a number of different strategies in order to address this, but the economic driver has to be one of those, is the big issue, of course.
Thank you, Lola. I wonder if I might ask Yann to just join, see if some of the questions that have come in through the chat, maybe we can turn to those. Yann.
Yes, we had one very interesting question. We all know that those kids, when they talk to fake agent or when they hit the road of migration, they have this vision that they can be the next Drogba. They have these inspirations. So we had a question about the role of athletes in both sides. In the communication about the issue, if there is inspiration of most of the youth, what could be their role internally of the communication we are, you just have been talking? And another question which is linked to that is what is the barrier of this high-level athlete speaking about trafficking? And I'm sure Nick or Kirsty will have a lot to say, but that's what we see. The question, the implication of high-level athletes, key athletes, in this communication and awareness processes, as they are from the beginning one of the inspirations.
Kirsty, please.
Yeah, I think this is a really important point. I mean, we know that what we're looking at here is exploitation of power differentials, and whether these are real or perceived power differentials. But the voices of these of athletes can be so important in really raising awareness. Raising awareness of some of these issues and raising sort of drawing attention to what can be, as mentioned, very difficult subjects, very taboo subjects. So we're talking both in terms of recognizing risks and what can be done, and also allowing support of different organizations to come together to look at recognizing and mitigating risks. But on the other hand, also in trying to promote a message of being able to speak out, of knowing what your rights are, what your responsibilities are, and ensuring a safe sporting environment and preventing these kinds of human rights abuses from being perpetuated through sport.
Thank you. Anyone else like to speak?
Can I just come in, Simon? And it's interesting because I think that you know what Laurent was saying about providing alternatives. I mean, you know, opportunities. Quite often, what's lacking, pure and simply, is opportunities. You know, young refugees see that on social media. Young people in the rest of the world, you know, have lots of opportunities that they don't have, and so, you know, obviously they want those opportunities, but you know, we need to be creative about how we create opportunities. And I think a really positive example of this is the Refugee Olympic Team initiative that was instigated by the IOC in 2016. Being a fairly frequent visitor to Kakuma refugee camp, where a number of these athletes were based, the difference in engagement in sports pre and post the Rio Olympics is phenomenal. Because suddenly these young refugees realize that there's an opportunity on par with young people everywhere else, that they can participate in a global sporting event, that there's a career path, that there is an opportunity, and so, you know, that's where I think that we have to get creative.
Thanks, Nick. I'm always struck by the experience that, you know, has been shared with me with colleagues from the International Red Cross, for example, of how important sport facilities, even just, you know, just a space that can be utilised in refugee and emergency situations, that what sport can give to people in those circumstances, you know, is really quite staggering in terms of recovery and rehabilitation, being part of their overall well-being, being physical, so the mental dimension of that as well.
Yeah, and I think the COVID lockdown is the perfect example that we can all relate to. You know, that just getting out of the house, doing some kind of physical exercise, moving around, it makes a huge difference. So, you know, imagine if you're confined for, you know, 15 plus years to that kind of space. You know, something like sport then has a huge impact.
Thank you, Nick. Is there any Yann and other question to come through?
Well, I have one. If I may, to Laurent, as you say, you know, awareness campaign is and communication is key, but it's not enough. We have to mobilize further solution. I know that IOM, so and you let us know if it's possible to talk about that. I've tried to approach some local club in Cairo to build a kind of cooperation, specifically to go further than simply awareness and communication. Can you talk a little bit about this partnership or this cooperation you are starting or trying to implement through clubs? What does it bring to your situations today?
Yes, of course, indeed. We have started discussing not only with clubs, with federations as well, either federations who are active in Egypt or the Egyptian Federation. There is an interest, I would say, to collaborate, but at the same time, there is they find it unbelievable that it exists, and I think it's due to the fact that it's maybe not communicated enough. We do not spot out the unsuccessful situation. We have each country, and Egypt is one of them, is showing Mohamed Salah or the national footballer as the most successful people on earth, but they do not say how many actually didn't succeed. So it's like a recruitment process. We take the best and we don't speak about who isn't successful. So they are open to discuss, but they would like to receive more data on the situation and the procedure and how it operates. And because it's irregular, because people, so it becomes a vicious circle, because people do not know enough, they do not report, so we do not collate enough information for actually making a case. So there is a willingness to participate in any activity, to work on training of federation or clubs. But we have to evidence it more. And that's where then a campaign, not to the people, but a campaign to institutions on the existence of this phenomenon is really important, to make sure that we have an appropriate reporting mechanism, which give us the tools to raise it at the highest level. We had also some clubs that, like, while it has been in Europe, there were some clubs which have been pointed out as having exploited youth. They do not want to be that much exposed in the media anymore, so they do a low profile. So while our objective is much more to show that we can have an ethical approach in recruitment by clubs, and they should actually put it as a label outside as a publicity that they are monitored for having no exploitation in their club, but we are not at that level yet, and I think we should work on these labelization, like ethical recruitment or exploitation free in sports, and to have institutions embarking in being proud of actually making sure that there is the administrative control and monitoring system for ensuring it doesn't exist.
Okay. Thanks, Laurent. I wonder if I might ask a question here around the issue of gender in this space. It seems to me that much of the default thinking is around young men in this environment, but I would hasten to say, and some of the evidence that I've seen suggests that young girls and women are even more vulnerable in this space, and I'm wondering if there's a dimension here which, particularly if we think about football, we tend to think about male football. If we think about trafficking, we think of that environment as the outcome, whereas, that's not the sole, dream that young people would have, and it's not the sole outcome where people will end up. And I wonder if there's something here to be said around the role that we could address in terms of gender in this discussion. Okay. Lola, please.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? I mean, I think there's lots of different parts of this space around trafficking and modern slavery in sport that are still, that need loads more research. And I think this is one of them. That would be the first thing I would say. But also I would say, I suppose that the discrimination and lack of equality for women in sport has probably shielded them from the worst aspects that have afflicted the men and the boys. Because at the moment, although I don't say that this won't grow, and you know, obviously, hopefully, I hope the women's game will grow and be much more successful, and there'll be much more equality in terms of the rewards that are available to women professional footballers, I'm thinking of. But with regard to the way that plays out at the moment, the money isn't there. Although, yeah, it'd be interesting to see if there's been a rise in that kind of exploitation, I think, in the years to come. The exploitation of females that I always see as analogous to that of sport that people have drawn to my attention would be through the fashion and beauty industries, where girls are lured in and through this kind of promise of being the next big catwalk model or designing clothes or whatever. I don't know about its prevalence in sport as yet, but as I say, I think we need more.
Thank you, Lola. I think we just lost you there at the end, but I think your point was well made. I wonder if there's, you know, there's potentially a scene for further research as to the extent to which gender plays a role in this. As you know, a number of women's sports, basketball's another one that might have a greater prominence and potentially more money involved with it, as to whether the correlation between the exploitation for human trafficking, you know, increases as that plays out. And if there's any other thoughts from the panel, or indeed the audience we have with us, anyone who'd like to chip in, please feel free. Kirsty, by all means.
I might add, yeah, I think this raises a really important point about the role that sport can also play potentially as a safe haven. So we've seen during COVID, we've seen an increase in calls, for example, to domestic violence hotlines being reported. We know that, for example, a lot of the measures put in place to reduce the risk of the spread can all be vectors of anxiety. So we've got, for example, we've got overcrowded living conditions, we've got being confined to certain areas. There's an increased risk for violence at home, for both experiencing or witnessing violence. And we know that women and girls are in a particularly vulnerable group there. And I think sometimes with the breakdown of protective networks, and these are protective networks which can be including school networks, education networks, including development programs or protective programs that are currently, for example, not able to play the same role. The breakdown indeed even of sporting activities, which may for some people provide the only safe place. I think it's important to consider that, and indeed the role of sport as a safe haven there, and the fact that that has also been taken away. So just from the other side a little bit as well.
Thanks, Kirsty. So I wonder if we're mindful of time is moving on, looking to the future a little bit, and without, you know, wishing to sort of indulge in too much, you know, crystal ball gazing, is there something here we can ask around, you know, the sort of likely, and I'm loath to say outcome, but the trends we can identify now and in the course of the last 3 or 4 months that, you know, COVID has brought into sharp focus, that we can see within the realm of human trafficking and modern slavery and sport moving forward? What would, you know, the outcome we'd like to see is that it ceases to exist, but in what ways can we see the existing trends manifest themselves in the next 6, 12, 18 months, as the, you know, we're going to be living with, you know, in all likelihood, COVID for at least that period of time, if not longer? How does that look? Laurent, please.
Yeah, the context of COVID doesn't look to us very positive in terms of the fight against particularly irregular migration and maybe and certainly exploitation, because but the first result is the socioeconomic impact. ILO has estimated 1/3 of the the population will lose their job. We see in countries like Egypt also, where migrants in particular are at 90% involved in the informal market, this is all completely collapsed. So the impact is huge, and indeed either they themselves decide to use smugglers to actually find opportunities elsewhere, or they can be lured by fake promises and embark into trafficking. I think there is an important aspect which may also, not only on the socioeconomic aspect, which will push people to look abroad for solutions, is the fact that countries may impose more restrictive conditions for entering or crossing their borders. And this is generally, we see a very conducive environment for traffickers and smugglers offering services. The price might be higher because the risk might be more complex, but more people will also be potentially interested because they may come from a country where the health infrastructure are not sufficiently developed, or there is no trust in them by some countries, which will then reject them for entering. And all these are potentially a perfect environment for exploitants or traffickers to act. So we need to take this into consideration in preventing this approach by offering or keeping, as I said, alternatives in the country, or keeping possibilities for anyone to contemplate the legal pathways to other countries. We have an additional situation which creates multiplies the issue at the family level, is the fact that already a lot of migrants have been asked to leave their host country because they've lost their job, or because there would be privilege given to nationals. So with the return to home, first, they do not have capacity to integrate the labor market, not that easily, but also the remittances is dropping drastically, and that's worldwide. So we'll see that when the family circles were receiving remittances from their family member abroad, this was covering essential goods and needs. With this drop, we may see families looking at alternatives by sending people whatever way abroad, and including being open to taking the risk for exploitation.
Thank you, Laurent. I see we have a hand raised from Kirsty's co-author, Olawale. Forgive me if I've mispronounced your name.
Well, thank you very much, Simon. I'd wanted to make comments earlier. I've listened carefully to the contributors, and I believe I sent a kind of a question earlier, and I could see the same thing that has been going on. I listened to Laurent, a very powerful intervention, and thanks to Kirsty and Yann, who try to bring in a particular issue. I think we are mixing up migrants and refugees on one hand, and in particular young athletes who are actually trafficked. And the Palermo, the TIP protocol, has a fantastic definition of human trafficking, which I believe in our analysis and the good work that Mission 89 and all the advocates are doing must continuously examine that definition. It has a three-part: the recruitment, the transportation, and the end purposes of human trafficking, which we know largely and will be mentioning labor exploitation and sexual exploitation. Of course, there is a third part of it, if you check it, which is harvesting of human organ, but that's not relevant here. What is relevant here is labor exploitation, whether it's in the football chain or in the sports chain, and sexual exploitation. And what we find is that in the same TIP protocol, in the Palermo protocol, when it comes to children, consent is immaterial. It's considered that they've been trafficked. So when you look at the work of agent, and I listen to Yann, and it's different from what Laurent is talking about refugees or migrants, whether they're irregular or not. These are kids or these are young people who are trafficked from their countries. Some promised lucrative clubs in Europe and in Middle East and other places. Some find themselves in the academy and they are now stranded as a result of COVID-19, and the exploitation continues. And what you find is because of these complex contract systems and what have you, it's been very difficult. Like one of the speakers pointed out, that clubs, I think it was Laurent, clubs even in Europe or in other places keep hiding under so many things with the agents. So Mission 89 is doing a fantastic job, but I think we need to be more targeted in terms of looking at kids that are actually trafficked from SOAS. They were recruited, and that fits into the definition of traffic. They didn't just leave their houses. Of course, there could be some who may be recruited from refugee camps or from migrant camps, but quite a substantial number of children we're referring to are actually recruited from Cameroon, Nigeria, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, or some other parts of South America. They are recruited, they are transported to their various destinations under false pretenses, which is another vital aspect of the Palermo protocol. You see the deceit in recruitment. And some are even made to pay so much money from their parents. FIFA, all of them have been trying to do some good work here and there, but I think it's been sidetracked or sabotaged. So if we're communicating, if we're advocating, we also need to carefully examine the modus operandi of how the academies are functioning, how the agents are undertaking their recruitments and other things, and be more targeted in our communications and how we deal with this. And again, I want to appreciate Mission 89 and all those who are working like Raffaella and others at local level. Last time in Istanbul, we heard about the migrants, their nutrition status and everything. It was quite an interesting discussion that you guys have with Professor Emre Edwagan and others. And I listened carefully, and I'm listening to the similar thing from Raffaella. So we really have areas we need to look into. But specifically in terms of trafficking, we must not forget the three components of trafficking. Recruitment. And recruitment is done from the source. Kids who are vulnerable. Their transportation and the means of recruitment is usually by deceit, by agents and all those involved. They're taken to some academies or to some other places. And when they arrive at their destination, you see the exploitation in terms of the contracts and so many other things, and hopes and dreams dashed. I just want to stop there because we can really continue to scale up the good job you guys are doing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your contribution. Sorry if I missed your intervention earlier, but thank you very much for that. Nick, did you want to just come in back?
Yes, I just wanted to comment on that slightly. I mean, I think that trafficking is the core issue we're talking to here, but we need to look at it more holistically as well. In some cases, that young people can be trafficked, but they can also be in need of international protection and can avail of international protection. And where in certainly Europe anyway, some states offer temporary respite in terms of what's available to victims of trafficking. International protection provides a longer term solution. So I mean, I think obviously we are talking about trafficking, but it needs to be looked at holistically, and that's why it's important that there's obviously within the scope of specific agreements, standard operating procedures, etc., information sharing, and that we coordinate on these issues.
Thanks, Nick. Again, just mindful of time pressing on. Yann, is there any other questions, comments, or hands raised that are coming through?
We received two questions, one specifically for Kirsty. Following the report that has been done on COVID and child rights, Kirsty, which gathers you present a couple of experts and practitioners. What is the main recommendation you can bring out of this report on the impact of COVID regarding specifically child's rights?
Thank you very much. So the report is it's a collaborative report which took into account the insights from 37 different experts, and it offers different opportunities that the COVID pandemic has provided us in order to actually push for change in this area, in the protection of child's rights in and through sport, and also some recommended actions. So we know that we need further research, for example. This is one of the main recommendations, that we know that we need further research in this field, and further research on the impact of COVID on children and child's rights. Another one of the key impacts is really, by looking at the sport-related impacts of COVID on children, we actually see a lot of opportunities about how children's rights and measures can be implemented in and through sport, as aligned and outlined in the Kazan Action Plan and similar international documents, where sport can, where we need to ensure that sport both protects human rights and child rights, and also measures can be implemented to reduce inequalities and to improve the lives of children. So, and another area that's quite interesting that we come up with as one of the recommendations is the chance that, we know that there are safeguards that need to be implemented across the board within sport in order to protect children, athletes from harassment and abuse, right from the grassroots level to the elite level, to be able to protect persons from trafficking, from human rights abuses which are connected through sport. And we have an opportunity here in the post-COVID world, or during COVID, to ensure that sports organizations implement mechanisms and implement strategies which consider the protection of children and the protection of vulnerable people in and through sport, and also to update these policies. We're seeing a huge increase in screen time and organizations moving online because of COVID, making sure that child protection policies and communication initiatives which are reaching out to vulnerable groups, making sure the policies include, the risk of online sexual exploitation and things like this, and that we ensure that in the post-COVID world, that in a bid to reduce costs, that we don't make safeguarding and the protection of vulnerable people cost prohibitive. Effectively, what I mean is that we safeguard funding for initiatives that look at the protection of basic human rights in and through sport, and that we also make sure that, so for example, in sporting events, safeguarding and protections included right through the life cycle of the event, and where we may be looking to sort of downscale or where there may be economic impacts at the moment, and where sort of sports organizations and sports competitions are changing as a result of COVID, that safeguarding and the protection of vulnerable groups stays one of the key elements and requirements for sporting practice.
Thank you so much, Kirsty. I wonder then if there's a line here around bringing together and recognising the points that Lola makes around the distinction, but where are the overlaps, and thinking as we take this forward, where are those meaningful touch points? Where is the overlapping Venn diagram? Where are the opportunities for us to work in sync, recognising that there are different circumstances, and a lot of this is going to be contextually specific, but at times you can have a situation where someone is a refugee, a migrant, trafficked and exploited all at the same time. They may not realise it, the authorities at one point or another may not realise it, but I think this is where that call to research on the one hand, and really championing the voice of those who've been through the experience, that lived experience, seem to me to be the one of the key determinants here. And that's not for very gratefully I've not been in that situation, so I wouldn't contend to provide a first-hand account of it, but I think some of the opportunities to reflect on those who we do meet in these circumstances, who have been in those situations, allows us to, share that experience and make sure that we're able to, draw together and think about some of the next steps for that. So again, I'm mindful that the time is coming together. I wonder if there's one further sort of set of final remarks colleagues might like to make who've been on the panel, and any of this is your sort of final call for questions elsewhere. But perhaps if we could begin perhaps in reverse order. So Raffaella, perhaps, what have you taken away from the conversation? It's a question to ask all of our panelists. What would you reflect on, having spent the last hour in this discussion? Thank you.
Yeah, there is a lot of questions, and I'm really grateful that you invite me to participate, because I think that networking with different, let's say, stakeholders for the human rights and specifically refugees and in sport is crucial. And actually, we are involved in different projects at European level with ISCA, the International Sports and Cultural Association, as FAIR, probably the Football Against Racism in Europe, the network. I am a member of the board, so I'm fully involved in these issues. I think it's really important to try to promote and advocate for these issues we mentioned, all of us in the discussion, but trying to address the different institutions. It means the sport institutions and national institutions, political, parliament, government, etc., but also the different institutions at more, let's say, global level, so European and world level. So if I think that there is something to, let's say, a remark on the things I heard today, is we really need to network more in order to develop the most effective actions. Specifically, as I told already before, we work in grassroots sport, and obviously what we see from grassroots sport reality is that first of all, we have to advocate and fight for the right of any citizen, and obviously refugees and asylum seekers and migrants in general, to practice and access with a full recognition of their rights in sport. And not only the elite sport, but also in the grassroots sport. And the absurd situation I just mentioned, telling you about the football team of Liberinante, is that many of the refugees and asylum seekers who live here and would like to practice a sport and practice sport at the grassroots level, at the amatorial level, they were even not accepted to be included in the game. So
okay.
The claim is to be included in the game, but this means an action toward the different institutions to adopt the rules and measures considering all the process of migration we are facing since decades. It's not just from today and not for the COVID situation.
Thank you so much, Raffaella. Laurent, if I could ask you to keep to a minute, if possible.
Yes, so thank you for this. I think what I take out of this discussion is the importance that we really all together, government, civil society, academics, work on making ethically unacceptable abuse of people, regardless their status, or would they be recognized or fall under a certain legal framework. So it's basically promoting human rights for all, that they be a migrant or whatever we call them. It's not important. Actually, there is a baseline of human rights for all that we need all to commit and guarantee. There is a role for everyone. I mentioned government, civil society, academics, but actually any individual on earth can be an enabler and facilitate the fight against exploitation that we sometimes witness without reacting. And maybe to conclude, I would really hope that sport can be seen as positively as it should be, As I mentioned when I started, Article 37 of the agenda, the Sustainable Development Agenda, is mentioning sport as an enabler for sustainable development. I think we really have to transform our world that way. And the role of everyone watching football, for example, and I think it touched billions of people, is extremely important. We have something to do, and not only bigger institutions and governments, but as individuals.
Thank you, Laurent. Okay. Nick?
Thanks, Simon. So I'll come back to the communications piece that we discussed right at the beginning. I think actually prior to this this discussion, my participation in this event sparked a fury of activity inside UNHCR to try and understand what it was that we were talking about. So actually, just the invitation to participate has raised awareness internally within our organisation of the issue, and something that that I will follow up with my asylum and migration colleagues in Geneva in the coming days to see how this fits into our overall framework. And then I guess the second bit is also communications related as well. It's to start having these conversations with our sports partners to see are they aware of the issue? If they are aware of the issue, what are they doing? If they're not aware of the issue, to make them aware of the issue, to link them up to the work that Yann and Lorena are doing, and then to see how we move forward from there. Thanks.
Thank you, Nick. Kirsty, if I may.
I would echo all of the previous points. I think they were excellently made. I think that sport has an immense power, and therefore a very important responsibility to be a vector for change and to raise awareness of important issues and to ensure that policies, procedures, mechanisms are put in place to ensure that people's participation in sport is protected, that they are protected, and that sport is not manipulated, or that effectively human rights abuses within sport, that we have mechanisms which are focused, which are research-led interventions to protect and promote people in and through sport. So I would just echo the previous comments, and also mention again the need for more research. I mean, at the moment, especially when we speak about COVID, everything is a lot of the time quite hypothetical, because we really need to get that research and also those perspectives from those most impacted to drive change.
Thank you, Kirsty. Lola, if I might turn to you in closing remark. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, I'll be quick. Again, all of the above, agree with what everybody said. I guess all I would say is that there seemed to me to be a proliferation of regulatory bodies in the sport sector, and this may be part of the problem as well as part of the solution. But I think with regard to all of the issues around equality, around discrimination, around abuse, and so on and so forth, it feels like there's a set of regulations that are in place, but people aren't implementing them, they're not monitoring them, and they're in denial. So I guess my sort of message would be to say to those bodies to stop spouting platitudes about how you like diversity and you want to help the vulnerable and all the rest of it. Just get on and do it and take responsibility for what's happening within the sector. That's it.
Thank you so much. Mindful that we've kept you here perhaps a little longer than we anticipated, I'm not going to speak for very much longer, but I would just like to join 2 points. I think one is about just recognizing the number of different stakeholders and issues and participants in this discussion. It may confuse, as Lola says, but it's also the grounds from which solutions can be found. And the importance of that network of networks, the essence of sport diplomacy, if you like, is about making sure that we are dealing with those overlapping Venn diagrams, making sure that people are in the same space at the same time and addressing some of these issues. So I'd really like to thank everyone for their contribution. And the second point is really perhaps to take up some of the challenge I took away from Olawale's comments about what to do next and how to think about this in different environments, making sure that we have the opportunity to have some of these conversations again, and they may be uncomfortable conversations to have at various points, but I think they're ones that are very necessary. I would like to thank you all for your contributions. I'll hand back to Yann and then we'll sign off. Please do take care of each other. Take care.
Thank you, Simon. Fantastic. Thank you, everybody. It was really a fantastic discussion. Very short, agree, because all these topics is so important. I just point out some point which I think is really interesting. And we talked a lot about the awareness and communication as it's key, but it is not enough. We need to mobilize solutions. We point out the fact that digital has to be perhaps activated a bit more. It was interesting to hear about the involvement of the sports sector and this idea to bring a kind of label which can facilitate the commitments of federations, club, and enlarge the spectrum of actors. Also pointed out a gender issue, discrimination of women in sport, and this COVID-19 economic impact, which shows that youth which have been facing trafficking, this commit the whole community, the family, but the whole community behind that. It's not just one youth which is impacted, but it's have a large impact. I also would like to thank the contribution and about labor exploitations. And indeed, migrants and refugees are two different environment, completely different environment. And it was really important to talk about these three key points, which is the recruitment of the youth, which can be done in many different areas, the transportation, which bring them to the exploitations. What I say, it's we've been learning a lot today. We need to learn more, as has been said. It's very important to advocate, to awareness, to assist, to empower, to integrate a solution. We need to network more, and indeed there is a role for anyone, and I think that's the key point today. And so I want to say, to finish, that sport could be and should be an investment, and so more than a solution for those youth, and we can be all very satisfied to see that there is a will of cooperating more. Thank you all. It was great to have the perspective of people from institutions, people from the ground, from the field of play, people who are really acting daily towards those problems. It's a great opportunity to Mission 18, for Mission 89 to benefit from all of you, and we really look forward to continue this discussion. Simon, fantastic work, great to all everybody. Thank you to all the people in the backstage, because it will never replace the face-to-face discussions, and a virtual meeting is a great opportunity, and so I encourage that we can continue on that. Thank you all. Have a great afternoon, and we look forward to seeing you and hear from you soon. Bye-bye.
Take care, everybody.
Goodbye. Thank you very much.
Bye. Thank you.